I'd like to begin with Donald Trump. The polls seemingly got it wrong again. So why was Donald Trump elected president over Clinton?
Mainly because of many years of resentment by people in the United States against the way that they'd been treated. It's a common thing now that people are beginning to say, why is it that we need to put up with this anymore? And there's actually quite a great deal of anger. You look particularly at the so-called Rust Belt, where people's jobs have been taken away by economic change they didn't ask for. You look at the enormous change in the United States caused by the more or less encouragement of mass immigration from the 1990s onwards by governments of both parties. You look at the way in which standards of living have gone down at the same time as people have felt that the society in which they grew up has become unrecognisable. And it's pretty easy to see that anybody who can articulate that is going to do pretty well in an election. And then when they're up against a candidate such as Hillary Clinton, who, for all her undoubted talents, is not particularly lovable, and also has spent an awful lot of time doing the sort of things which politicians do, which don't make people feel that you're one of them. I think it didn't surprise me. When people asked me before the election, how's it going to go, I said, I simply don't know. It's impossible to predict. One has learned, particularly when they're close, not to take the opinion polls too seriously. But I wasn't surprised when Donald Trump won the election at all, because of the huge amount of resentment which is abroad in almost all Western societies now about what has happened to what you might call normal people.
And what do you think a Trump presidency means for the rest of Europe?
Well, I have no idea, because one of the things about Donald Trump is that you don't actually know what he's going to do. His record as a businessman doesn't suggest that he's necessarily terribly reliable, and so what he's promised to do in politics may not be any more reliable than what he promised to do in business or in the famous Trump University, of which you've doubtless heard.
And do you think you can draw parallels between the kind of what's happening in America with Trump and what's happening across Europe? I suppose with arguably Brexit or Le Pen in France?
Very loosely you may, but each of these circumstances is different. I particularly dislike the comparison between Trump and the movement to leave the European Union. The movement to leave the European Union is a rational rejection of a mistaken policy which people quite reasonably took. The problem with it has been not that it was a mistake, but that it took the form of a referendum. So you now have a policy without a government to implement it, and also a movement which won the most stunning election victory in modern times and then promptly dissolved itself, which has left us with a huge gap and a major constitutional crisis. But those are other issues. It's not the kind of irrational decision to back somebody who you can see. Nobody looking at Donald Trump can fail to see that this is not a person you would necessarily want to trust with the future of a major country. He has, let's put it very mildly, immense character flaws. He's coarse. His personal life doesn't suggest that he's particularly, how should we say, sensitive. And I think for people to actually decide to have someone like that as their president is a much bigger departure from political normality than a vote to leave the European Union. France has its own problems, and Germany has its own problems, and the Scandinavian countries have their own problems as well, but they're not really comparable to those of the United States.
And sort of moving on to Brexit,
I never use that term, by the way.
I think
always makes me think of a rather unpleasant laxative breakfast cereal, and I just don't, which is my joke, which has been pinched from me by others. I really don't like it as a term.
What we'll go with is throughout your career you've been deeply critical of the European Union, and now that we've voted to leave the European Union...
I wouldn't say that actually. For a long time I was completely and utterly preoccupied with the Cold War, and you couldn't really... I remember an old friend and colleague of mine called George Gale, when I worked on the Daily Express in the days when it was a newspaper, and George Gale was completely convinced, long before most people were, that the European Union was a grave mistake for this country. And I treated what he said with some levity. I thought that he was wrong, because I was so completely concerned with the Cold War, which seemed to me to be the great struggle of the age, that I really couldn't see a menace from Brussels. So it wasn't really until after the Cold War was over that I began to understand what an important thing it was.
And what changed for you? So was it?
I think really because once the Soviet threat had gone, which was in my view real, the group of Soviet forces in Germany was an enormous thing. East Germany practically sank under the weight of military equipment and troops there. And had it not been for the counterweight of nuclear deterrence, the Soviet Union would have dominated Western Europe and would have liked to have done so. And when that threat went, we were all relieved of a great burden. But once it was gone, it was clear that we hadn't suddenly moved into a paradise or a utopia where everything was terrific. What we moved into was a new continent where a reunited Germany was naturally, because of the size, cultural, moral and economic importance of it, was naturally inclined to dominate the continent. And in fact became much more dominant after reunification than it had been before, and that caused problems for us. It was obviously in our interest to have a stable, prosperous Europe, but that didn't necessarily mean having us being governed from what was effectively a foreign capital, and this seemed to me to be increasingly oppressive and bad for us. Decisions were being taken which weren't in our interests, far away, which we couldn't control.
And when it comes to the European Union, like a lot of young people voted to remain. What do you think the future will be like for young people in this country now that we've left the European Union?
Well, I don't necessarily see why it should be any particularly different. There's this great confusion between Europe and the European Union. I yield to no one in my enjoyment and pleasure in travelling in and visiting the European continent and appreciating its huge cultural contribution to the world and everything else. The idea that people who oppose membership of the European Union are xenophobes who daren't go abroad and who hate it is the most ridiculous accusation, and one had to spend half one's time simply fending it off. I was often in a room of people who were saying this, the only person who'd actually lived on the European continent, as it happened not in the European Union but in Moscow.
Yeah.
And therefore I found this particularly contemptible, to be told that I was some kind of stay-at-home xenophobe. It's not about that, nor is it about travel. Before we joined the European Union, plenty of people known to me travelled and worked in countries on the European continent. So what's to be lost? What's changed is that we're no longer governed from the European Union headquarters in Brussels, and our Supreme Court will no longer be in Luxembourg, where it is now. And this is a major thing. Independence in a country is an important thing. Most of us have applauded the independence of countries freed from various colonial yokes over the past 60 years. Why then are we so unwilling to be in favour of the independence of our own country? I don't understand why anybody wouldn't want their own country to be independent of foreign control.
Some people in this country have said that this is the most right-wing conservative government, and they say other things about the BBC, whilst other people like yourself would say that this is by no means a conservative government whatsoever, and in fact the BBC, for example, have a kind of left-wing bias. So my question was, why is there such polarisation when it comes to analysing this government and our institutions?
A lot of these things come from the fact that people don't have any idea what they're talking about. Most people, most of the time, in my experience, don't have any idea what they're talking about, and because they've never bothered to check. And my great advantage in this is I'm a former Marxist-Leninist, and I understand the categories of politics rather better than they do.
Right.
And that's, the idea that the Conservative Party, because it calls itself the Conservative Party, is a conservative body, is ridiculous. The Conservative Party is an organisation for retaining office for the sons of gentlemen. It would guillotine the Queen in Trafalgar Square with marching bands playing if it thought that would get it into office. It has no other function. It doesn't have any politics. Its current politics, because it's learned to fit in, are roughly the politics of equality and diversity, of political correctness, which is a term I dislike but for which I can find no substitute, of hostility towards national sovereignty, all a standard package of post-1960s self-righteous belief which has replaced Christianity among thinking people in most advanced countries.
And you mentioned your leftist roots, which are quite well publicised by yourself, and something that I found quite interesting is in your blog this year, you said, for the first time in my life, this country is actually coming to resemble the Marxist caricature of crude money and power. Yeah. And what I was wondering is that, do you ever have second thoughts about, because you were a proper kind of convert of...
I was the most dreadful homicidal Bolshevik, yes. I would have set up a police state tomorrow and murdered people who disagree with me. I'm not going back to that. When they first stated it, it was a caricature. The world was not like that. The world they sought to overthrow was not like that. Not even the Russia which they overthrew. The Russian government, which the Bolsheviks overthrew, was the first liberal democracy Russia had ever had, for instance. People forget this. The Tsar fell in the February Revolution, and what the Bolsheviks overthrew was an attempt at a constitutional government which had just begun the first moves towards a proper democracy, and it had probably the first and for many decades after the last free elections that Russia had ever seen, and that's what they overthrew. They lied all the time about what it was they were against, and after they overthrew it, they lied about what it had been. And the left tend to do that quite a lot. They don't scruple. Because they very much are ends justify means people.
In one of your many Question Time appearances, you were asked the question, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was about the future for young people. And your response was that I think young people should emigrate before it's too late. I was wondering, do you still feel the same?
It's good advice. You should take it.
And a bit
I wouldn't stick around here.
Why? Like that's...
Well, because I've never seen a more doomed society. I've lived in a doomed... I lived in the Soviet Union. I saw a doomed society, so it collapsed. Catastrophes happen. I've never seen anywhere more ripe for catastrophe, economically, culturally, and almost any other way you care to name. Everything is running out. If you want to discuss economics, there's the current account balance. There's the complete catastrophe of our trade balance. There's the enormous level of personal and public indebtedness that cannot be paid. The inevitable price in inflation, which that will actually exact. The first step of it, which has been misattributed to the European Union referendum, was the huge fall in the value of the pound in June. That was just an excuse. It had been due to fall. I'd been predicting it would fall for ages. It will fall further. I would not be at all surprised if within a couple of years the dollar is worth more in the world markets than the pound sterling. Maybe then people will begin to realize how serious it is. And then you put together with that an education system which would shame Haiti, a criminal justice system which is almost falling apart. Our prisons are a disgrace, uncontrollably full of criminals we don't deter, but not big enough to contain the huge number of criminals who we neither prosecute nor punish. So we have all these disasters going on, and a general social meltdown caused by a social catastrophe of the collapse of marriage. Put all that together with economic decline, unwanted mass immigration and discontent, a huge economic gulf between the southeast and the north, the accelerating breakup of the United Kingdom, and you have all the ingredients for a social catastrophe. Well, it's coming. I wouldn't stick around for it. I have to stay. I'm too old to leave.